Hi guys, and welcome to your lesson. And the topic today is troubles abroad. While we've already started talking about some of the troubles domestically that Washington faced, and we even touched on some that he faced from foreign countries, today we are going to focus more on the troubles abroad. Again, the reason why we are doing a flipped lesson today is because in class time today, we will be having a Socratic seminar for group 3. So our objectives today are as followed. We're going to explain how Americans and George Washington responded to events in France. And we're going to discuss how the U.S. settled its difference with Great Britain and Spain. So let's start here. The French Revolution. It began in 1789 and ended in the late 1790s. Here is a picture on the right. That is a picture of the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. So, as we talked about in class, the French Revolution began mainly because France had a costly involvement in the American Revolution and an extravagant spending habits by King Louis XVI. Unfortunately, those habits and that involvement in the American Revolution caused bankruptcy, and the royal fund was depleted, and there had been 2 decades of poor cereal harvest, a drought, cattle disease, and skyrocketing bread prices had caused a massive unrest among peasants or poor citizens of France. In fact, many of them were starving. And it became a huge issue, and it felt as though many of the people in power weren't listening to the issues of the citizens of France. And at that point, because of the bankruptcy and because of their ignorance in regards to how the citizens were living and what they were up against, the government began to impose heavy taxes, which upset citizens even further. French citizens were inspired by the American Revolution. And on July 14th, 1789, the citizens of Paris, France, attacked the Bastille, which was a hated prison that held the enemies of the French crown. A lot of these people were people who refused to pay the tax, or maybe people who stole from the French crown. And quite frankly, they were starving. And you know, it wasn't necessarily their fault. They needed to eat to live. So it wasn't necessarily, all these people weren't necessarily in prison for something that they actually did wrong. Morally, I guess. During this rebellion, the citizens overthrew the monarchy, which, remember, that is when there's a king and a queen, and they captured the Bastille. This revolution shocked many, mainly because of the beheading of King Louis XVI in January of 1793 and Queen Marie Antoinette later that year. Now, Americans' response to the French Revolution was two-sided, like any story. They're the supporters. You have Thomas Jefferson, who is the former U.S. minister to France, and fellow anti-federalists were in favor of supporting the revolutionaries in France. Jefferson actually wrote to a friend about the scene, and he said that he was fortunate to see in the course of 14 years 2 such revolutions as were never seen before, because he got to witness both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which he was really grateful for. He believed that the French were imitating the colonists' desire for liberty during the American Revolution and agreed that the citizens of France should actually establish a republic. Others, like Alexander Hamilton and fellow Federalists, were opposed to the violent riots. They didn't think that all that bloodshed was necessary. and they believed that they had gone too far, and it was just too much. A few months after the French Revolution started, France and Great Britain actually went to war. And as you know, some Americans backed the French and while others backed the British. The debate over U.S. foreign policy actually, unfortunately, it divided Congress and split Washington's cabinet right down the middle. And after considering way different options and arguments, Washington presented his own views to Congress, which led to the Neutrality Proclamation. The Neutrality Proclamation stated that the United States would not take sides with countries at war in Europe. And Washington believed that this plan would be the safest and most reasonable option. However, not everyone agreed, and some newspaper editors and members of Congress criticized him. And James Madison actually questioned Washington's right to issue the proclamation without Congress's approval. All in all, this really upset Thomas Jefferson, and he just didn't like the light that it put onto the relationship between France and the United States. As a reminder, France helped the United States during the American Revolution. They had our back when the United States was fighting against the British. So, according to Thomas Jefferson, he really didn't understand why we wouldn't help them. A lot of what they were going through was partially caused by the United States. They went into debt because of us, and didn't really understand why anyone would side with the British when, in fact, the British were the ones we had just established our freedom from. And might I add, later on, we're going to talk about some of the things that the British continued to do to the United States after we've gained our independence. Jefferson also felt that the pro-British Hamilton was influencing the president's foreign policy, and Hamilton's influence interfered with Jefferson's duties as Secretary of State, or at least that was his feelings. And as a result, Jefferson eventually decided to leave Washington's cabinet. And in December of 1793, Jefferson resigned. Obviously, seeing your cabinet fall apart is never something that a president wants. We're seeing that happen where we've watched some people resign or get fired from Trump's current cabinet, and that's been super stressful for the White House. The decision disappointed Washington, and he had high expectations for Jefferson. He thought he was honest and talented. And some 30 years after he resigned, Jefferson actually expressed his views of President Washington, and although he disagreed with much of his policies, Jefferson had great respect for him as a president. So you might ask, are there more foreign problems? Do I have to listen to more of Miss Young speak? Unfortunately, you do. Next up, we have Jay's Treaty. Washington experienced other threats to U.S. neutrality. In late 1793, the British began seizing all ships carrying fruit to the French West Indies. In the process, the British captured hundreds of neutral American merchant ships, and rumors also flew that the British officers on the western frontier were encouraging Native American uprising. The British had never abandoned their forts, as the Treaty of Paris required. So that was another reason why, we were concerned with the British. Now it looked like the British might side with Native Americans in a war against American settlers, and that, in fact, they began arming American settlers. This was seriously alarming to Washington. And part of what the British were doing, they were picking on us. They were bullying the United States. They were upset that we had fought for our independence and that we won. It was kind of like having an ex-girlfriend who keeps texting you or, blowing your phone up. That's what the British were doing. They weren't letting it go. Alexander Hamilton even recognized that this might be a path to war. So President Washington and Hamilton decided to send the first Chief Justice, John Jay, to London to work out a peaceful resolution. His task was rather difficult. The British knew that the United States lacked a strong navy. Also, many American businesses relied on the trade with Great Britain. However, the British didn't want to actually fight with North America. They didn't want to fight with the United States. So luckily, when Jay went to London, he was able to work out a treaty called Jay's Treaty. This treaty was an agreement that was established on November of 1794. The British agreed to pay for damages for seized American ships, and small American merchant ships were allowed to continue trading certain items in the Caribbean. The British also said they would abandon their forts on the northwestern frontier, and in exchange, the United States would pay the pre-revolutionary debts it owed to the merchants. Unfortunately, this treaty didn't go well. The treaty did not prevent Britain from capturing large American ships or supporting American or Native Americans on the frontier. It also did not make the British return slaves they had freed during the Revolutionary War. And although Washington disliked the treaty, he felt that it was the best that the United States could do at the time. At his urging, Senate approved the treaty. And again, the treaty wasn't very successful. Any other problems? Do I have to keep listening? Yes. Pinckney's Treaty. Now, this treaty was a little bit of a success story. Along the frontier with the Spanish Florida and Louisiana, American settlers faced a problem. The Spanish disputed the border between the United States and Florida. So right here is what we're going to be looking at. As a result of the dispute, Spanish closed the port of New Orleans to U.S. trade in 1789. New Orleans was an important port. All goods moving down the Mississippi, which is right here, all goods moving down the Mississippi to places in the east or overseas had to pass through this port of New Orleans. So closing the port separated settlers on the western frontier from their most important link to the world outside, as well as financial gains. Washington asked then U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pinckney to help, and what he did, Pinckney asked Spanish officials to reopen the New Orleans port in request of a right of deposit. And a right of deposit is when someone has the right to transfer goods from one ship to another without paying a cargo fee. This right would allow American boats to transfer their goods at New Orleans without paying that cargo fee. After, long discussions, the Spanish minister Manuel de Godoy tried to delay reaching an agreement. He hoped that Pinckney would grow desperate and sign a treaty favorable to the Spanish, but Pinckney was really patient. He was able to wait, and he did it in a way that really benefited the United States. Godoy became worried that the United States and Great Britain might join against Spain after signing Jay's Treaty. Little did he know that the treaty was a bust. So he agreed to Pinckney's Treaty, which was signed in October of 1795. Under the treaty, Spain agreed to change the border. Spain's government also reopened the port of New Orleans to American ships and gave them the right of deposit. Because it opened the frontier to further expansion, Washington and most other Americans considered this treaty a success. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want you to please take the time to copy the notes, and that should be your homework for the evening. I have placed a key in Schoology, and we're going to talk about this a little bit further in class and move on to how split the nation became.